Thank you. It's great to be here to have an opportunity to speak. My name is Bryan Riley. I am with a new group that's emerged in the last several months, Westmoreland County Racial Justice. We have been organizing pretty regular Black Lives Matter protests, looking at some other ways to get involved. We've connected with Fresnel, we've connected with the NAACP, so we're really trying to get involved in the community. We've also did an anti-Asian hate demonstration a couple months ago. So those are the kinds of things we're doing right now. I'm also a licensed professional counselor, and with a pretty extensive background in trauma. And what I want to talk about today is something that a lot of people haven't heard about. So let me say, first of all, I am not and will never pretend to be an expert on the Black experience. But what I do want to talk about is the role of generational trauma and the way that that's a factor in the mental and physical health of pretty much every historically oppressed community. So generational trauma is essentially the ways in which the trauma of a previous generation impacts descendants. So what we know is that when someone experiences a trauma, it doesn't just impact them. It impacts their children, it impacts their grandchildren. This happens for a variety of reasons. Some behavioral, some biological. We do know that people who don't feel safe in the world, sometimes because they have been victimized, sometimes raise children not to expect to feel safe in the world. That's not blaming the victim, that's recognizing the psychology that happens after a trauma. We also know that trauma impacts the ways connections are formed in our brain. So it's not just a behavior thing, it really is, it changes the brain, and it also changes us on a chromosomal level. So that trauma becomes literally embedded in our genes. And so the ways we are biologically changed by trauma is unavoidably passed on to our children as well. Now, anyone can be a victim of trauma, and any family can experience this, but I think it's also important to recognize that there are communities that experience generational trauma. Dr. Dana Da Silva, who's a trauma expert, said systemically exploited and being systemically exploited, enduring repeated and continual abuse, racism, and poverty are all traumatic enough to cause genetic change. So the phrase that stood out for me is repeated and continual abuse, racism, and poverty. And how familiar that sounds to Black and brown communities in the United States. Generational trauma changes thought processes so that things become embedded as norms in whole communities. And so symptoms of something like post-traumatic stress disorder, which includes feeling like someone's always out to get you, so always looking over your shoulder, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless, having an increase in high-risk behaviors. Those things aren't just individual, they become communal norms because that is what reality has taught you to do. That is what the world has taught you to do. Generational trauma also, over time, impacts bodies. What we know now is that the immune system is weakened in people who experience trauma, and that weakened immune system is passed on genetically. We know that at the very level of nerve formation in the brain, there is a change in what are called telomeres at the brain level. Everything about us is impacted by trauma. So what that means is that all of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder are much more likely to be present and be a factor communally for Black and brown, and I would add LGBTQ communities in the United States. So the complicating factor for this, though, is when you treat trauma, part of what you do in treating trauma is you start by reassuring the person that they are safe in the here and now. That's what I do as a therapist. But the reality of being black in America is that it's damn near impossible for me to reassure a young black man that he is safe in America. Because he's not. Because you all know that the traumatic, the danger, it's not something that happened in the past and is over. It's not something that a community can move on from because it is a finished event. It's something that keeps going on and on and on. And so mass incarceration, which is essentially ongoing slavery, which keeps reopening the wound of slavery over and over and over, re-traumatizes. Police violence ensures an ongoing sense of being constantly at risk. And police not having adequate training to address mental health when they do encounter someone experiencing a mental health crisis also creates an increased risk. Systemic racism that's created generations of poverty that results in a sense of a lack of power, hopelessness, and a lack of options. All of these are things that create intergenerational trauma. The fact that, for those of you who are African American or brown people, 30 to 40% of the country wants to make it harder for you to vote. 30 to 40% of the country wants it to be harder for you to vote because they don't want to give up their power and privilege. So PTSD treatment only works when trauma is over. For the black community, the trauma has been going on since 1611. You have now endured 510 years of generation after generation being brutalized by a system that sees you as commodities. Trauma is pretty much embedded in your DNA at this point. So I don't have a great solution for this. I do have some suggestions. One, take your own mental health seriously. If you're struggling, if you're feeling the need to talk to someone, if you're experiencing any kind of mental health stuff, take it seriously. Address it. Talk to somebody, see a therapist, see a psychiatrist, talk to your clergy person. Don't let things go. And the second thing that needs to happen is in every community, it needs to be normalized to seek mental health treatment. And that starts with each and every person here taking what you've learned today and going back to your communities and talking about your mental health so that it's normalized for other people to talk about their mental health. Don't tolerate when we talk about racial injustice and some white people try to change the story and engage in victim blaming. One of the things I hear all the time is, well, what about black on black violence? And so the reality is, not that that's not a thing, it is a symptom of 500 years of collective generational trauma. Don't let someone change the narrative to blame the victim. And finally, the thing that I've found that is most helpful for my own mental health in a time like this that I encourage you to do is to stand up and fight along other activists and allies. Because what I found, what my clients often find, is that having a sense of taking action, doing something, not just sitting around and feeling overwhelmed and powerless, but saying, by God, I'm going to take action. And doing that in a collective with other people who are taking action and share the same values is incredibly healing. So thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me talk about this.